Wow. I feel like a mega church preacher up here, looking out. The Black Joel Osteen, I guess. My name is Tony Norman, and I am a newspaper columnist. And I understand that this is supposed to be like a TED Talk style presentation, but I'm an ink-stained wretch. I don't have those kind of skills. You know, I'm not the mayor, I'm not Jasiri X, I'm not one of Pittsburgh's top movers and shakers like Grant. I'm just a disreputable newspaper columnist. And in that capacity, I just want to, talk for 5 minutes and tell you a little bit about what I feel is happening in Pittsburgh. When I moved to Pittsburgh from New York nearly 30 years ago, the city was a mess. There weren't even street signs downtown. And the street signs that were downtown weren't even in English. Now, people who were here will back me up on at least a little bit of that. I'm only slightly exaggerating. And though Pittsburgh wasn't belching fire out of blackened smokestacks, it conformed to the most stereotypes of what a post-industrial city was supposed to look like. The air was clearer than it had been in decades, but that's because the mills had shut down in the early 80s. The heavy metal particulate count had dropped, but there was still enough despair swirling around neighborhoods like Homewood and Garfield in the Hill District to take your breath away. My wife and I had an informal deal to go back to New York the second she was done with her studies at Pitt's Graduate School of Economics. I was ready to cash in that promise sooner than later because as an underemployed and often unemployed black man with a college education, Pittsburgh didn't have a lot to offer me. I also had a short afro at the time, but I couldn't find a place to buy a pick, which struck me as very, very strange. In the fall of 1987, that to me was the kind of economic indicator that mattered. What kind of city were we living in where we couldn't accommodate a brother trying to rock an old school hairdo? But fate and luck intervened. I was able to quit my part-time telemarketing job when the Post-Gazette hired me full-time. My wife got her master's and found a job that allowed her to work at home. She abandoned her pursuit of a PhD once we started having kids, 3 boys. And we bought a house in Swiss Helm Park, a neighborhood that no one had ever heard of on the edge of the East End. And suddenly, it didn't make any sense to go back to Queens, where the 5 of us would have to scratch out an existence in a small apartment in Astoria or Flushing. And so, despite being fortunate enough to find the perfect niche at one of the city's then 2 big dailies, it was clear to me that as a black man, Pittsburgh was in no hurry to shake off its old school parochialism, whether of the racial, social, or economic variety. When I came to town, Teenie Harris was still very much alive, but floating around like a ghost, enmeshed in poverty and trying to get out of an onerous contract with a guy who had the legal rights to his treasure trove of photographs that chronicled the history of Black Pittsburgh. Teenie's plight was a metaphor for not only Black Pittsburgh, but for all of the forgotten Pittsburghers who have talent and resources that aren't recognized. Though he was fortunate enough to have lawyers from Reed Smith working pro bono on his behalf, institutional recognition of his enormous talent and the value of his photographs was years away. Sure, he was celebrated in the barbershops and the beauty salons of Pittsburgh's Black communities, where some of his photos adorn calendars for funeral parlors, but there was little appreciation of his iconic power and national appeal. There was a glimmer of appreciation for his talent but not enough to move the institutions that could have spared him the indignity of poverty in his final years and help him claim a more significant place in the city that would celebrate his legacy with lavish retrospectives years later. Teenie Harris died broke and underappreciated in a town he effectively immortalized with his camera. That happened in what I call the old Pittsburgh. Such a travesty is less likely to happen in what Pittsburgh is becoming for a variety of reasons. These days, we're more likely to ask questions specifically tailored around how to go about advancing the just and sustainable city we know Pittsburgh can be. We know that as the heirs of Teenie Harris, Marianne Williams, Francis Scott Key, and Andy Warhol, we no longer have to be confronted with the false choice of either self-exile or death in obscurity when trying to make it in this town. As new people have come into this community for school, for work, or for the challenge of just trying to make it in Pittsburgh, they've brought a lot of fresh ideas and thinking with them. They've entered once moribund institutions and made them more receptive to new ideas and ways of doing things. More importantly, new people have brought fresh sets of eyes and values with them. They're able to look at the people and places old-timers have taken for granted with the enthusiasm of new converts. And more importantly, they're willing to roll up their sleeves and work. A new optimism is beginning to take root. There's a new realization that Pittsburgh's greatest resource isn't its cool restaurants or its riverfronts. Our greatest resource are the people already here. It can be seen in the do-it-yourself ethic of the residents of Homewood who are teaming up with the city to buy the empty, abandoned lots next to their homes to convert into community gardens. It can be seen in the visionary entrepreneurship of a young Justin Strong who opened a club called Shadow Lounge in a rundown commercial area of East Liberty years before Whole Foods arrived. It can be seen in all the public and private efforts to reach into marginalized neighborhoods with efforts to draw out and recognize the talent and humanity of the young people there before it is validated somewhere else. Currently, Pittsburgh is not a just city, but it is on its way to becoming one. It may top many of the most livable city lists, but those of us who know the city best know it's still in its chrysalis stage of development. It has a long way to go. Much of the progress here is still concentrated in a handful of communities. Not too long ago, my buddy Karamaji Rajumba, the Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation, said something uncharacteristically wise for him. We were in the middle of an argument, and he said that contrary to its reputation, Pittsburgh is a very diverse city. The problem with Pittsburgh is that it isn't integrated. Still, there's a willingness on the part of many of the major players in town to encourage the talent that is already here to grow and assert itself. After all, the foundations and the philanthropic community stepped in to save the August Wilson Center when it had failed and many had written it off for dead. And today it is clear that the August Wilson Center has found its footing and is carving out a space in a larger cultural community. So there's no denying that there is a growing openness to change and leadership that is truly inclusive. We will hear about that over many sessions over the next 2 days. For this session on advancing the just and sustainable city, we'll hear from Angela Glover Blackwell, President and CEO of PolicyLink. And she will be followed by Majestic Lane, Deputy Chief of Neighborhood Empowerment of the City of Pittsburgh. And finally, we'll hear from John Wallace, a professor at the School of Social Work at the University of Pittsburgh. And he's going to put some bones on some of my vague ramblings. And thank you very much, Pittsburgh. This is an honor to be here. It's good to see you folks. And you know, if I may put in a plug for the Friendly Neighborhood newspaper, please buy the Post-Gazette, please. I don't want to have to start looking for a job because I'm not going to find one. Thank you.
Hello. I'm Angela Glover Blackwell, CEO of PolicyLink, and I am delighted to be back with you here in Pittsburgh for the P4 celebration and continuation. I was here the last time, and I must say that I'm really excited to be invited back because the last time I felt like the skunk that came to the garden party. For those of you who weren't here, let me review for you what it was that I said. I was so excited about Pittsburgh because I'm a city person. I love cities, and when cities are making a comeback right now, I am just thrilled because I think that the cities are really the jewel in the crown of the country, and we have neglected them so much. So I was excited to see Pittsburgh celebrating the fact that it was making a comeback, being deliberate about how to guide that. And I wanted to point out that the excitement would have to be tempered if the comeback is not an all-in comeback. I had to point out that if it turns out that Pittsburgh and the P4 and the effort to be able to attract businesses and excitement, if it doesn't get really embedded with equity, if it doesn't lead with equity, if it doesn't achieve equity, it's not a model. It's not a model for the nation. It's not a model for the world. When I use the term equity, what I mean is just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. I pointed out that the things that are needed for the future really require that those people who are going to be the future are ready to lead, ready to contribute, ready to be full partners. As you know, we're rapidly becoming a nation in which the majority will be people of color very soon. What that means is if people of color don't become the middle class, there'll be no middle class. If we don't tap the entrepreneurial spirit that people of color are just so full of, we'll be missing that entrepreneurial spirit as we think about how we're going to be in the economy. I made the point that the equity agenda, while it will always be the moral agenda, has become a national and economic imperative. And that Pittsburgh had to figure out how to be fully inclusive. And if it didn't, things would fall really short of the magnificent aspirations. The amazing news for me, and I hope that it's good news for you, is that that challenge that I put out has been completely picked up. Obviously, it was on people's minds before I mentioned it, or it wouldn't have been picked up the way it has been. I've been working with so many people here in Pittsburgh. PolicyLink, the organization that I lead, has become complete partners with Neighborhood Allies and Urban Innovation 21. And we have been thinking together about how to make sure that the development of Pittsburgh is fully inclusive, that it's an all-in Pittsburgh, that everybody will be able to offer their talents, to benefit, and to be able to completely participate and help to make this one of the most exciting cities in the nation. We know that if we get it right in a way that is sustainable. The good news is that the agenda that Grant talked about, in which we see ourselves in the other, in which we really are doing everything we can to lift everybody up, that agenda will always be the right thing to do, but it's going to produce in the long run. If we get rid of inequities in income and employment, the GDP of the nation will be $2.1 trillion higher. In the Pittsburgh region, it'll be $5 billion higher. So we know that getting this right is going to make the economy right. But we also know that it's going to invest in the environment. It's going to make sure that we deal with the planet in ways that are necessary. It will make sure that the places in Pittsburgh are places where everybody can feel good about living, where all the neighborhoods are contributing. Everything comes down to people. It always does. And so as we think about how to be able to translate the desire for equity and inclusion into the development, what we concluded that we needed was an equitable development strategy. An equitable development strategy is the way to get at the equity outcomes. And when you think about equity, what equity does is it takes the conversation out of trying to make sure that everybody is getting the same thing, and puts it in the context of asking what is it that we want people to achieve and what inputs are needed in order to achieve that. It might mean very different inputs, that if people are starting far behind, you may need to invest a lot more in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of neighborhood stability in order for all to be able to contribute. That means when you focus on people, when you focus on equity, you have to have a focus on results. And if you're focusing on results for people, you've got to measure those results. You have to have metrics that are people-centered. You've got to be able to think about what are the outcomes that we want and how are we doing. Asking that how are we doing question is not a question that can be answered if you're not measuring how people are doing. So as we think about equitable development, we've actually landed on a few things that are absolutely essential. One is we have to raise the bar on new development. If we're going to lead with equity, if we're going to focus on equity, if we want to achieve full inclusion, we've got to raise the bar and make sure that we're bringing the equity agenda when development happens. We don't just let the development happen hoping that it'll trickle down. We get in front of it and we lay out some aspirations. We develop what the measurements are going to be for progress, and we embed in it exactly the strategies that are going to help that development achieve the equity goals in terms of stable housing in neighborhoods that are really attractive and connecting people to opportunity, in terms of jobs that are living wages, making sure that we raise the bar on new development. And then we have to make sure that in the development process that every community is a healthy community full of opportunity. We know that in this nation that we have become a place in which where you live is a proxy for opportunity. We know it when we just look around. We feel it when we're making decisions about where to buy our own homes. We know that where you live is a proxy for opportunity. It determines whether or not you get to go to a good school. It determines whether or not you live near opportunity or a transit system that can connect you to opportunity. It even determines how long you live and how well you live while you live. And so in the development process, we have to focus on making sure that every community is a community of opportunity. But we also have to expand employment and entrepreneurial activities. To be able to fully participate, people need jobs, but they need good jobs. Jobs with living wages, jobs with benefits, jobs with the prospect of being able to move forward into career. And so in the development process, we've got to focus on what kind of jobs are going to come with this development. Who's going to get these jobs? Are there going to be contracting opportunities that can be unbundled so that entrepreneurs of color and women will be able to participate? The development process has to be clear about that. The next thing we have to focus on is embedding racial equity in every institution and in every business. If we're going to achieve equity, we're going to have to be clear about race. We're going to have to be clear about who's being left behind. We're going to have to face the agonizing, unattractive history of race in our communities. There is the story of race in America, but the story of race in America is played out in every one of our communities. We have to reflect on that and think about how race continues to operate, how it's become institutionalized, how it's no accident that Black men are disproportionately incarcerated, that it's no accident that the same communities that are redlined are the communities now that are suffering from underinvestment. investment. It's no accident that people have not had access to the jobs that have the biggest possibility of being able to move forward. The things that have happened that have created the racial inequities did not happen by accident, and they won't be fixed unless we focus on them directly. So we're going to have to really embed a racial equity analysis and lens in everything that we do, whether we're thinking about water, whether we're thinking about transportation, whether we're thinking about housing, businesses that are thinking, how are we going to build the workforce that's needed, businesses that are thinking, how are we going to make sure that our relationship with the community is one that is healthy and helps to really be in this together. It have to embed that racial lens. And we have to build the power, the voice, and the agency of community members. That we will not have what we want if we don't do it in partnership. PolicyLink, working with Neighborhood Allies and Urban Innovation 21, and talking with community groups all across this community, we really recognize that there is a power difference. There is a voice difference. There is an agency difference. And when you invest in building that power, that voice, that agency of people from the community, truths come forward. Insights come forward. Things don't get pushed under the table. Issues get dealt with for the length of time they need to be dealt with in order to get solved, not just the length of time that people are interested in this new thing that's coming up. To have sustainable change, you have to really be in partnership with people who understand the problem in depth. These are the challenges that we face. And as we think about it, I love the 4 Ps, the people, the place, the planet, and performance. But I have a suspicion that we might need a 5th. And that 5th P is policy. Because none of the things that we've talked about will be achieved if we haven't embedded in policy the need to be able to move forward. Think about this issue of housing. It's so predictable that as soon as a city that has languished for so long with people being forgotten, with neighborhoods being neglected, that when the city begins to come back, the first people to get pushed out are the ones who've needed what's coming the most. The people who have needed the jobs that are now coming to their city. The people who have needed entrepreneurial activities in their neighborhoods. The people who have needed for the institutions to have the resources to be able to produce what's needed in terms of education and job training programs. The people who have needed those investments the most are the ones that get pushed out. That problem won't be solved without policy. The first policy ought to be raise the bar on new development so that whenever you're doing anything, you're thinking about how to embed affordability the way that they have done in San Francisco. And I lift up San Francisco not as a model for you to copy, because San Francisco is a place that has waited too late to deal with the affordability problem. The black population in San Francisco, just during the time that I have lived in the Bay Area, has gone from about 14% to less than 4%. But what I will say about San Francisco is they're getting it right now. Too little, too late, but right nonetheless, and I want to lift up their model, is they had a new development going up in the Bayview-Hunters Point area. They got a community benefits agreement with Lennar, one of the second largest developers in the nation, to make sure that 32% of the housing would be affordable, that there would be a real focus on people who had lived in the community in the past to be able to come back. And I happen to know that they hired a search firm to go out and find people who had been displaced by some of the Hope 6 activities so that people would actually know they had a first right to some of the affordable housing, but making sure that people who lived there also had access to the new housing, making sure that the jobs that were coming on were paying living wage jobs. That kind of policy is essential for being able to go forward. But also supports like in Detroit, where they have a microloan program. Huntington Bank put up $5 million to make sure that local entrepreneurs would have access to the capital and the networking and the technical support that they needed. So far, they put out $1 million, and they've been able to preserve or create 236 jobs, and they've helped some companies that wouldn't have been able to make it. But we've got to be able to also think about inclusionary zoning policies to make sure that the housing remains available. We, as a nation, are at a crucial moment. You, as a city and a region, you're at a crucial moment. I don't know how many other chances we're going to have to get it right in America, but I do know that the conversations that are happening, the people who are convening, the policies that are being embraced, the wonderful spirit that I'm feeling right here in this room in terms of commitment to inclusion, that's where you start. And we all are going to have to do something important and different to be able to keep going. We know we didn't get here overnight. We're not going to solve the problem overnight. It's going to take patience and persistence. We know that the hurt has been so deep, the neglect has been so long, that if there's a tendency to say, I hear you, but is this really going to be anything? It's going to be something if we all stay in it and make it something. We've got to have patience, but we have to have some confidence in our own abilities to be able to do something different. We have to measure what we're doing. We have to talk about what we're doing. We have to be able to lift up what we're trying to do even as we haven't finished. The job here is to make sure that we keep people at the center of what we're doing. Because in the end, this is the work of unlocking the promise of the nation by unleashing the promise in us all. Thank you.
Peace and good morning. How's everybody doing? Come on, y'all know me. Come on, it's not there. Good morning. How's everybody doing? We're not, this is a conference, but it's an unconference, right? We don't want to just be so tight that we can't kind of have a conversation. So first thing I want to say is in 1988, there was Bobby Brown was the king of R&B, and he used to do videos, and he used to have this thing on his face, right? And I've never had one on before today, so I feel like Bobby Brown, and he's still the king of R&B, no matter what anyone thinks. So I'm channeling Bobby Brown today. So today's conversation for me is about a journey, all right? It's about a journey from one place to another. It's about a journey from a boy to a man. It's about a journey of cities. And how do cities grow? How do cities change? And how do cities evolve? And that's one of the things that I've dedicated my life to. That's one of the things that everyone in here has dedicated their lives to. So we're going to have a conversation, and then we're going to get to a challenge, okay? So you see the picture. A lot of people cue in, this is West Philadelphia, and then people say born and raised. We grew up close to each other, but we didn't live in the same place. So this is the view I saw as a child, okay? This is what every day when I got on the train to go to school, this is what I saw. And I saw the wonder of downtown. And the city and what the city represented always meant so much to me, all right? My experiences and the experiences that were happening in my neighborhood were a little different than maybe in other neighborhoods, but it always made me think about the possibilities, and we're going to come back to the possibilities. And from that, this is where I learned how cities operate. You felt the city. I was a child, so I just dealt with whatever the city gave me, okay? And I learned a lot of things. So now I want to transition. At 18 years old, I came to Pittsburgh, the University of Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh is where I came to know myself, okay? Pittsburgh is where I came to learn about cities. I came to learn about the other side of Pennsylvania. Now, I didn't see this view when I first came in. I saw, the cathedral and Tower A, Tower B, and Tower C. So it didn't look quite like that when I got here. And also, to be frank, when I got here, it was a different town. There was a time where things were different. There was a time where when I got on the T, people looked at me. There was a time where you could catch one bus to Monroeville Mall, right? There was a time where you couldn't go in certain neighborhoods. So in all the things that we're experiencing and going through, we do have to remember that we did have a different time. And we're in a good time. We're in a good moment. We're in a moment of change, all right? We're in a moment of that 5th P, possibility. But we can't let the window pass us by. We have to make sure that we seize the time and we're focused on what it means to truly be an equitable city, what it truly means to be a just city, what it truly means for the city to become all that it is. So we're in a good space. So a couple years ago, I would be on Facebook. You know, people kind of get into long, drawn-out Facebook fights. So what I started to do was just say 3 things, and I would not say anything else about it, right? So I wouldn't argue, I wouldn't discuss it, I just would say it, and I could get it out the way. And what I found was people started to listen. People started to respond and talk about various things around economics, community development, pop culture, whatever have you. So today I want to talk about 3 things, and hopefully, you know, you kind of get something out of it. Some folks may be aware of it, and some folks may not. So let's go to the first one. There is always a there. And there's always a there, and particularly around marginalized communities, okay? There's always a there where communities have been disinvested. There is presence. There is something. It is not something to be put upon. It is something to build with. There is a difference between placemaking and place growing. And I got to give a shout out to my friend Calvin Gladney for the place growing one. I decided to make it all one word, so that's what it is. It's one word now, place growing. And third, it's more than place, it's race. And I'll get back to that when we go through the process. So number one, there's always a there. In our development, in cities all across the country, we hear a lot about what it means for place and how cities are changing and how neighbors are blighted, how neighborhoods are disengaged. And we use words that are almost violent in their nature. We use words that come close to erasure, all right? We use words that downplay who people are and their experience, even in the face of all that has happened in cities for the last at least 60 years. So one thing that I want everyone to come out with, there's always something there. There's always something to build from. It's not always easy to connect to it. It may cost more to talk about it. It may cost more to engage it. But what you actually do is create places where people feel comfortable, where people want to be, and it provides a connection. So I'm going to show a picture, all right? This is a picture of the Larimer School in the Larimer neighborhood, okay? So you look at it, number one word, it's blighted. It's abandoned. I see resilience. I see self-awareness. I see the fact of taking really bad lemons and making really good lemonade, okay? I see the fact that we have to acknowledge the presence of what communities do and build upon that in order to create places that attract people and retain people, okay? So this is just an example, and you know, this current administration, the Mayor Peduto's administration has really been supportive of the Larimer Consensus Group, of the Choice Neighborhood process, and you'll see a lot of development, how we look at places and make it equitable for all. But I just wanted to always bring us back to when you see one thing, you can also see something else. So, number two, there's a difference between placemaking and place growing. Placemaking is the rage. We hear creative placemaking, this kind of placemaking, that kind of placemaking. You hear it all over. What I'm going to submit to everyone today is that we have to be concerned with growing places, and you can't grow places without growing people. People have to be at the center of the process of what it means for neighborhoods to change. So, if everyone looks at this beautiful, cycle here. Can anyone tell me what's missing from this diagram? People, energy, life. It asserts that you do something to people, not with people. It asserts that this is how you can create a community without necessarily engaging that place to be a part of it. Now, I know that in our city, we're not thinking like that. I know in other cities, we're not thinking about this, but this is what we must get away from. It can be very easy to go into a place and identify how to shift it. We know how to move markets. We know how to move buildings. We know how to fix buildings. We know how to do that. We have to dedicate ourselves to the development of people, all right, as steadfastly as we are dedicated to the development of buildings. And that is the interlocking between people and place that's so important to me and so important to many of you. So this is the third thing, and this is the elephant in the room. It's easier to talk about neighborhoods and communities than it is to talk about racial inequities and racial disparities. And sometimes racial disparities are talked away within neighborhood, within access, within opportunity, without engaging the fact of the consistent racial inequities we have in our city and we have in our country. And I think we can't really begin to change places and help people until we fundamentally engage the fact that we just don't have a place problem, we have a race problem. And whether that is immigrants, whether you're talking about the refugee population, whether you're talking about Latino populations, the African American population, and then if you want to extend it, we have gender problems, right? We have these disparities that we can't talk away by just talking about place. So to that end, you see the percentage of 18, 16, 4-year-old black residents living in poverty in Pittsburgh in 2011. So you see over 30% of the black population at that time is living in poverty. It's very difficult to redo neighborhoods if 30% of a population living in poverty. We have to worry about preservation. We have to create affordable housing. We have to do inclusionary zoning. We have to do all the things that preserve, but we have to create pathways of opportunity and pathways of growth. We can't preserve our way out of this. In order to create a just, livable city, we have to make sure people are leaving poverty. And we can't leave that in the conversations. And to all who are creating those pathways, those opportunities, I salute you, and we all have to really be thinking about that as we create these places for families. And this is the second one. This is the ratio of black and white unemployment in the city. And what you'll see is that we're over 2.5 to 1. Again, an unemployed person is not the person that's going to be able to buy the home, to reinvest in the home, to pull equity out of their home. So when we're talking about this, we have this racial disparity that we're trying to resolve. So in the beginning, I showed you the picture that I had of Philadelphia. And now Pittsburgh being my home, adopted home, second home. My challenge to everyone in here is to make sure that every child in every neighborhood, all 90 neighborhoods, feels that fifth P of possibility every day they wake up. They have that same feeling of wonder, no matter if they live in Northview Heights, Carrick, Beachview, Homewood, Hazelwood, Squirrel Hill, Spring Hill, no matter where you live in this city, we have to rededicate ourselves and we have to double down on the reality of creating the possibilities for everyone in our city. Thank you.
Good morning. What's up, family? Now, it's nice we had these people from outside Pittsburgh come and talk about, I came here and I got changed. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was born, you can go, give it up. I was born 2 months before African Americans became citizens of the United States. You know that little amendment that said people could vote? 1965. Now, before I get started, the Heinz Endowments has told us we're supposed to do social media stuff. And so I'm trying to get my Twitter game up. And so if I take a picture of myself, it's called a selfie. And if I take a picture of you, what's that called? We're in Pittsburgh. A Yinzi, right, okay. All right, very good, we're ready. Now, so Pittsburgh, America's most livable or most leavable city. In 1985, I was a sophomore at the University of Chicago. And an announcement was made that rocked the nation. Anybody know February 27th, 1985? Anybody know that date? That was the date that Rand McNally Places Rated said that Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was the #1 most livable place in America. And so since that time, example, The Economist, this was 2014, I believe, said that Pittsburgh is the most livable city on the mainland again. Condé Nast, the travel magazine, said that Pittsburgh was one of the top places to go in 2015. This is crazy. Pittsburgh named one of the most livable cities in the world. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, is there 2 Pittsburghs? But it's interesting. Since 1985 to today, Pittsburgh has received all kinds of kudos, right? Most affordable, bikeable, hikeable, livable baseball park. The baseball park is actually true. Stunning videos, all of these things, right? But we've also had a series of studies done over many years, but even very recently. The Regional Quality of Life Survey, the work recently done by Neighborhood Allies, Innovation 21, and Policy Link. The work done at the School of Social Work, where I am professor, Pitt's Racial Demographics, and on and on. So we see these documents that tell a slightly different story than the one we hear in mainstream media. Summed up in many ways, Harold Miller says, and if you look at that last paragraph, well, first of all, African Americans are being left behind by Pittsburgh's economy. There's some rankings you never hear about, however, because they aren't statistics that we can be proud of. They show that tens of thousands of our region's minority residents are not sharing in the region's overall economic progress. They're worse off than almost any other major region in the country. So look at some data. I had an assignment from Tony Norman. He said I was going to do some stuff for him, so I got to do that. So first of all, as you know, our region is the least diverse in the nation. You see on the far right side, the little red bar, that's Pittsburgh, and about 13% of our population is non-white. This is a map of our segregation. So you see the areas, particularly on so orient yourself there. The point is there to your right. My right, your left. And then you see that area on the east end is black. Little area down there in Clareton is white, black, and the rest of the region is white. And the reason it's white is because it's white. Majestic just talked about our segregation, but also the intersection between our segregation and our poverty. So this graphic shows you that 60% of Pittsburgh's African-American population lives in neighborhoods that are over 20% poor. That's a metric that we use as sociologists. On the flip side, over 60% of our white population lives in neighborhoods that are non-poor. So we have residential segregation, we have poverty, and so the intersection of race and class are intricately woven. And in fact, I would argue that race causes poverty, right? We often talk about they're entangled or difficult to disentangle, but literally one causes the other. So we're drilling down. This is a neighborhood that I love, Homewood, Pennsylvania. The fascinating part about this, so we've talked about residential segregation, we've talked about poverty, and as we go closer, what we'll see, in this graphic, the yellow areas are properties owned by people who do not live in the state of Pennsylvania. The teal is people who live in Pennsylvania but outside of Pittsburgh. The light blue are people who live in the city but not in 15208. And finally, those darker areas are people who actually live in the neighborhood. What does it mean when a neighborhood is not owned by the people who live there? I was talking to a friend of mine, and he said, I'm on the computer right now, and I'm looking at a house for sale across the street from my house. The house is for sale for $2,500. The house is for sale on eBay, and the house is being sold by someone in London, England. What are the implications for that when you live in a neighborhood where people are selling your property in another country? Then we dig more deeply. Many of you will recognize this street. So I took this picture, and what do you see there, right? Blight in all of its glory. It's fascinating, however, I turned around, took a picture. On the other side of the street, you see this. From this to this, literally across the street. Anybody know the distinction? I'll tell you. This piece of property has been owned by people, California, New York, Europe, all over the globe, literally. This piece of property, owned by African-American developers, both properties are Section 8. I'm sure they were finished on the same day of the year in 1910 when they were built, but the distinction is local ownership and people who care about the property and the people who live in those houses. Infant mortality, right? This is sort of the key metric of the well-being of a country. How do your babies, your youngest do? Pittsburgh, if you look at Allegheny County, actually, the bottom in the red, Allegheny County's infant mortality rate is about almost 14 infants die per 1,000 births. African Americans' rate is, in fact, almost 3 times the white rate of 4.75. And just for point of comparison, Jamaica's infant mortality rate is actually lower than Pittsburgh's African American infant mortality rate. Let's keep going. Poverty among our children. These are 5-year-olds. Pittsburgh's children, 62% of them live below the poverty line. Even more striking, that less than 15% of Pittsburgh's white population, their 5-year-olds, live below poverty. So we literally have these two worlds. So when people really act like they don't understand what we talk about with regard to these racial disparities, I actually believe they don't. So when you look at the residential segregation, we're living in different worlds. You look at the differences in poverty, you look at infant mortality, and we have these differences, and people are many times oblivious to these realities. The Pittsburgh Promise. Anybody know the Promise? I want to show you some amazing data. So these are our schools, right? These are our 612s and our high schools. So you have Kappa, Alderdice, SciTech, so forth, down to Malliance. And this is the persona of the kids who are free or reduced lunch, or our poverty metric, right? So 38% of the kids who go to Kappa live below the poverty rate. In Malliance, it's 88%. Now, we have a little thing here in Pittsburgh that everybody supports called the Pittsburgh Promise, right? I'm a Head Start graduate, class of 67. Anybody in 67? Wow, everybody in here is rich. Anyway, Head Start is this program for poor kids. So I'm a Head Start graduate. So the idea that you would have a scholarship to be able to attend any school in the state of Pennsylvania, from CMU, Pitt, Haverford, Bryn Mawr, Penn, the Art Institute, the Trade Institute, game changer. Game changer. Would you agree? The problem is, the kids who attend our schools who are poor are also the children who are least likely to be eligible to receive the Pittsburgh Promise. Now, I see those of you who have young children scribbling stuff down and all that. That's not cool, right? Kappa. Anybody know where Kappa started? Yeah, Homewood, right? Fascinating story about Kappa. So I was talking to this guy, and he tells me the secret, right? You know how when people are telling you a secret, they kind of look around? So he says to me, look, if your kid doesn't have any talent and you want them to go to Kappa, stage crew. Stage crew. I was like, what? He's like, stage crew. You got a kid with no talent, you want to go to Kappa? Stage crew. I just told everybody, so now you know. Stage crew, right? But what does this mean when our children who are least likely to succeed? Oh, wait, I got one more slide. The correlation is minus 0.87. You had enough statistics to know that that's high and it's bad. So if I know the school you attend, I can almost predict perfectly the likelihood that you'll receive $30,000 to attend any school in this state. This picture reminds me of an experience I had. I was at the YMCA in Homewood, and I was preparing for a meeting. And so the kids were running around. It was their summer program. Kids were running around, and I'm standing there just kind of watching and laughing. And so the counselor says to the kids, hey, kids, get in line. And this little boy, about 4 or 5 years old, reminds me of my kid when he was that age. He says to her, are we going to jail? And that broke my heart. Why does a little African-American boy in the neighborhood in which I was born and raised feel like someone asking you to get in line means that you're preparing to go to jail? Something is very wrong. The region's African-American economic well-being. So there's an article in Forbes talking about the best places for African-Americans. And so they looked at the 52 largest metro areas in our country. And what we see is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, my home, was tied for San Francisco for number 48. You don't understand what I'm saying. So look here. You got the Bengals down here. You got Cleveland. You got the Lions. Philadelphia, who, by the way, we can't beat for whatever reason. New England, the Dolphins. The Ravens, the racist helmet, and the Falcons. Okay? It's bad. Not surprisingly, African Americans are much less likely than our whites to say that Pittsburgh is a great place to stay. So you look, whether we're talking about the city, the county, or the MSA, 30% difference in saying that this is a positive place to be. Related to that, in the regional survey, they asked people the likelihood that they'll be in the region in 5 years. Almost, or a little bit more than a quarter of our African American population said that they were expecting not be in the region. In preparation for this, stumbled across the statistic in the inflection point report that the Allegheny Conference just did. 10% of African Americans coming to the city of Pittsburgh have a bachelor's degree. 14% of the people leaving have a bachelor's degree, right? So you have a brain drain, you have a leakage. And so despite the fact that there's going to be literally hundreds of thousands of jobs available, Pittsburgh is not a place where African Americans want to stay. I stumbled across 1839, Janera Solomon's online mag, and there's a section in there called Why Pittsburgh, in which African Americans are talking about their experience in Pittsburgh. And it's interesting, this issue, there were 3 articles in there. If you look at the bottom, Why I'm Leaving Pittsburgh, it's an constant uphill battle. Why I Stay, Sustaining an Artist's Life in Pittsburgh, and Why I'm Leaving, Fighting to Exist. So 2 of the 3, 2/3, 66% of the articles were talking about why people wanted to leave. Well, unlike the folks who are having this conversation, I came back to Pittsburgh. So again, I was born in Pittsburgh in 1965, left in 1983, promising to never return. And it's interesting, for my parents' generation, success was literally the ability to get your kid up and out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So the question I asked myself when I stumbled across this article was, why did I come back? But when I came back to Pittsburgh, on those visits between college, graduate school, a tenured professorship at the University of Michigan, I came back, but I saw opportunity. And I saw people who love this city as much as I do. So I came back, and in coming back, been able to do a bunch of fun stuff. So we started a program at Westinghouse at the University of Pittsburgh. We have college and high school. So we have 15 young people who are actually dually enrolled. They're students at the University of Pittsburgh. This semester, taking an introduction to social work, calling it an introduction to social justice. And our kids in Homewood are students at the University of Pittsburgh. They'll have a transcript and 3 credits at the end of the semester, at the end of the year. That's amazing. Only in Pittsburgh. A few years ago, I helped to start a nonprofit called the Homewood Children's Village, inspired by my friend Jeffrey Canada's work in Harlem. We have been working, despite the fact that folks have now discovered community schools. We've been doing community schools in Homewood now for about 6 years. And in the 2 schools in which we work at the elementary level, both of them have achieved star status, meaning they're among the fastest improving schools in the state of Pennsylvania. And while they remain challenged, the fact is that they are improving. And so the directionality has been changed because of the intervention of people like you, like our university, like people in Homewood who care about young people. Another organization with which I'm affiliated, Operation Better Block, literally going door to door multiple times, every door, engaging the community in its own development. I have a phrase I call withintrification, when the people who live someplace are involved in its transformation. And so we actually have a database with every property, every parcel in Homewood is listed in our database, and we can tell you the status of ownership, tax status, who lives there, and other details about the property. And now our next wave of data collection, we're actually interviewing the people in the homes, and we'll have a complete data set on every piece of property. We're helping people save their homes. One family member, the grandmother, I believe it was, died. The property was then in the hands of 25 different family members. Operation Better Block helped get those family members to sign the paperwork, and so that person actually owns that home. A woman had been victimized by a predatory lender. a balloon loan. She didn't understand what was going to happen. Operation Better worked with her to get an attorney to get that issue resolved. And so we're actively involved on the ground. Where else can that happen? When you can combine data, relationships, and the engagement of attorneys to save someone's home. That's the kind of stuff that happens only in Pittsburgh. I don't know if you saw the PG for the last 2 days, front page above the fold has been talking about this work going on in India and in Homewood. My colleagues in the business school and in engineering, we have next to our building in Homewood, have this off-grid greenhouse. We're capturing over 1,700 gallons of water. We're teaching our kids, most importantly, the part I like, you see our babies in the greenhouse or the bio shelter, talking about wastewater management, talking about alternative energy. Where else, other than Pittsburgh, in a neighborhood that many people think of deprived, can you have children and they went on a field trip recently and the guy was asking them about, did they know what a rain barrel was? And the response is, do you know what a bio shelter is? Where else can that happen other than in Pittsburgh? Crazy excited about this. I see my colleague John Folan in the front here. A coffee house idea that we've been tossing around since 2009. 2009. Does anybody say 2009? 2009. 2009. Hopefully, as a matter of fact, I don't know if I can say this, but Lord willing, Lord willing, in November of this year, this coffee house is going to open. Will be Pittsburgh's first completely cashless coffee house, located in Homewood. You'll be able to flip open your laptop, Wi-Fi, coffee, and you can friend me too. Coffee, soup, salad, sandwiches, and it will undoubtedly be Pittsburgh's most diverse coffee house. Where else can you do that in Pittsburgh? Next steps, real quick. Decide to make Pittsburgh most livable for all. I argue this is the most important conversation right now that I've had up to this point. It becomes a decision. You see, when we can have cars driving around with nobody driving them, when we can take body parts out of people and put another body part in them, when we can take diseases and cure them, I'm convinced that we can transform neighborhoods. But it begins with the decision. Second, collaboration is critical. We have an amazing funding community, but we also have to have the other parts of our community decide that we're going to work together until we get this done. And the equity conversation that we were having is critically important. It's just like if you have children. You got 4 kids, like in my case, 4 kids. One of my children, her teeth were all over her mouth. We got her braces because she needed them. But I didn't feel like I owed my other children $6,000 because they didn't get braces, right? You meet the needs of folks as needed. Number 3, implement best practice recommendations from previous efforts. We are the studyingest, report-makingest, plan-buildingest people in the world. Can we implement something? Finally, focus. Look, there's 4 fundamentals that my father and my grandfather taught me. Education, employment, entrepreneurship, and real estate ownership. The fundamentals that have worked for generations in this country that unfortunately so many of us have been denied. Those are the fundamentals. My grandfather told me that he worked in U.S. Steel, in fact, for 42 years. And his supervisor told him, he said, Ralph, if you were white, I could make you a foreman. But since you're not, right, because an African American cannot be a boss for a white guy, you continue to put coal in a hot furnace for 42 years. But the truth of the matter is Pittsburgh is a different place today, and it can be a better place. But if we focus on the fundamentals, we can get this done. So my vision is in 2026, 10 years from now, when we're having a P4 or P5, I guess it is, it'll say Pittsburgh region recognized again as most livable for all. I'm John Wallace. Hey, PGHA attendees, let's make Pittsburgh most livable for all. Thank you.